Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010. So this next reading is written by Nick Bostrom in 2003, and it's entitled The Simulation Argument, Why the Probability That You Are Living in a Matrix is Quite High. So, the movie The Matrix. I put a link on the YouTube section of our class website with the red pill, blue pill scene from the movie The Matrix. If you haven't seen the movie, most people have. It's back in 1999. The whole idea is that most of us live in a computer simulation. And some people can escape and they can awake, they can, rise out of the hallucination. Then they find themselves in this kind of an incubator egg and they can go back to biological reality and walk around, and then they go back into the matrix. They plug themselves back in with some connector in the back of their head, and they help other people get out of the matrix or the computer program. So that's very similar to Plato's cave allegory, and that will actually be the very first discussion question. But let me just go over his basic argument here. It's only 4 pages, not even a full 4 pages. So he's got two working assumptions. He only explicitly underlines one of them as an assumption, and that is that consciousness or minds are what he calls substrate independent. So he believes consciousness comes from material combinations of material atoms. We have carbon-based biological neurons, but he's saying consciousness could be based on some other computational substrate, such as silicon-based processors. That's at the top of page 220. So the next paragraph, he says about, 3 sentences in, he says, but ultimately what allows you to have conscious experiences is not the fact that your brain is made of squishy biological matter, but rather that it implements a certain computational architecture. This assumption is quite widely, though not universally, accepted among cognitive scientists and philosophers of mind. For the purposes of this article, we shall take it for granted. So there he's saying we're going to have this argument as just a starting assumption. So consciousness depends on what he calls computational architecture. He's interpreting that to mean, I'm pretty sure, that it's the architecture of some physical material atoms, that what gives rise to consciousness is the geometrical pattern, the architecture with which you organize certain material atoms. However, you don't necessarily have to take this granted assumption, this assumption he takes for granted in a materialist way. Computational architecture, for example, could relate to some kind of a spiritual substance. This is something that John Locke discussed. Maybe consciousness is annexed to some simple spiritual substance. He says that's probably more true. But whatever the computational substrate, whatever the substance within which consciousness is rooted, he's saying here that it's the organizational pattern that substrate takes on. One idea that I've been working on and talking about in some of these videos is the idea of the singularity, the gravitational singularity being synonymous with the self or the soul. That it's a point without extension in space, but it contains all space and time. And the computational architecture, if that theory is true, would be that the architecture of consciousness is a central point surrounded by a sphere and I'm referring to Leonard Susskind's holographic string theory, where the sphere is the horizon of the universe, which is like a holographic film, on each point of which all of the information of the entire universe from the past, present, and future is imprinted, interwoven by these fundamental threads. Radiates back in, I don't want that thing going off, with the cosmic microwave background radiation to create this holographic illusion that we live in. So this very similar to what Nick Bostrom is talking about. Maybe we live in some kind of a an illusion. It's also very similar to what Plato is talking about in the cave allegory, and that is our first discussion question, as I mentioned before. But so there's the first assumption of Nick Bostrom's argument, that he believes it is likely that we live in a computer simulation of some advanced civilization. And that is his second assumption that he doesn't explicitly make. He's just assuming that there are other species in the universe, that life is not unique to planet Earth. He doesn't say, I'm making this assumption. He's just taking that for granted without even saying he's taking that for granted. I think most even atheist physicists and cosmologists agree that there probably is life elsewhere in the universe, because the universe is so enormous. It's filled with so many galaxies, which are filled with so many planets, that the chances are there's probably life elsewhere. So, taking that into consideration, he says, all right, if there are, he doesn't say if there, assuming that there are species on other planets in the universe, you're left with three assumptions that you have to take into account to discount the idea that we live in a computer simulation. So at the bottom of page 220, he says, all right, so he says, now we get to the core of the simulation argument. This does not purport to demonstrate that you are in a simulation. Instead, it shows that we should accept as true at least one of the following three propositions. The chances that a species at our current level of development can avoid going extinct before becoming technologically mature is negligibly small. So he's saying there, when you get to an advanced level of technology like we have on Earth now, chances are you'll go extinct. So more than likely, we'll never surpass our current level of technology, or no other species will, because when you get this high, you die, you kill yourselves off. The second proposition here is almost no technologically mature civilizations are interested in running computer simulations of minds like ours. So assuming that there are species who do survive beyond our level of technology, they would no longer be interested in running simulations with people like us in them. Then the third proposition is you are almost certainly in a simulation. So he's saying on the top of page 221, each of these three propositions may be implausible, yet if the simulation argument is correct, at least one is true. It does not tell us which. So he's saying if proposition 1 and 2 are false, then 3 must be true. If it is not true that species kill themselves off when they achieve our level of technology, and if it is not true that mature civilizations would not be interested in running simulations like ours, then it is almost certain that we live in a simulation, because the number of simulations that this mature civilization could run on computers that, of their high level of technological sophistication, they could run innumerable mirage-like virtual realities. So the ratio of the simulated realities to the actual, what he calls, the people who are actually living with organic brains would be incredibly small. It would only take one civilization with organic brains, if they had the technology to create virtual realities, it would only take one such civilization to create innumerable virtual realities. So the chances are we probably live in one of those virtual realities and not in one of the creating civilizations that create the virtual realities. That's his argument. So then, at the bottom of page 221, he says, how should it change the way you live your life if this was true? He said, your first reaction might think that if 3 is true, meaning if we most likely live in a computer simulation, then all bets are off, and that one would go crazy if one seriously thought that one was living in a simulation. So to reason thus would be an error. Even if we were in a simulation, the best way to predict what would happen next in our simulation is still the ordinary methods: extrapolation of past trends, scientific modeling, common sense, and so on. To a first approximation, if you thought you were in a simulation, you should get on with your life in much the same way as if you were convinced that you were living in a non-simulated life at the bottom level of reality. And then he goes on to say, maybe you might figure out that the advanced civilization that is creating your virtual reality is a descendant of some contemporary Christian fundamentalist he talks about here. So then you might think, well, if I live according to the Christian rules in this simulated universe, then my creator, whoever's running this computer simulation, might upload me into physical reality. And I could be giving, an artificial body in that higher level where the creating civilization lives. So that is his basic argument. And the discussion questions on page 223. Compare the view here with Plato's allegory of the cave. So they're both similar in the sense that they both say it's plausible to assume we live in some simulated reality, that there's a deeper level of reality that creates this illusion and kind of keeps us imprisoned in this illusion. They're both similar in that, but they're fundamentally different because for Bostrom, the bottom level of reality is biological brains, material bodies that give rise to consciousness that then creates virtual realities with sophisticated computers. Whereas for Plato, the bottom level of reality is eternal and spiritual. It's ultimately the idea of the good. So completely different worldviews giving rise to very similar descriptions of the world we experience, at least in the sense that they both say we live in an illusion. Another difference is that Plato says you would definitely want to get out of that cave and then help others get out. And the way to do that is to control your material appetites and try to separate your soul as much as possible from your body while alive so that when you die, you're not dragged back into lower levels of reincarnation by bodily appetites. And so that if you live closer to the eternal ideas imprinted on your soul while alive, that your lot in the afterlife will be better. And his theory of reincarnation is related to that. So Bostrom doesn't talk about reincarnation. He talks about being uploaded out of a computer simulation into some physical material world, but that material world would still be biological and subject to decay and death. So that's completely different from Plato's allegory also. Okay, so discussion question 2. Compare what he says about the idea that the third possibility is true to what Nietzsche says about amor fati. So the third possibility is that you are almost certainly in a simulation. And what he says at the bottom of page 221, he says your first reaction might think that if 3 is true, then all bets are off and that one would go crazy if one seriously thought that one was living in a simulation. Then Bostrom says, why should you go crazy? You've been living in a simulation your whole life, so just go on living like you've been living. The world operates according to the same laws that you're used to, so what's the big difference? Of course, if you were a materialist and you don't believe in a soul, you could say, well, your consciousness was going to die when your body died anyway. What's the difference if you're part of a computer simulation or a random fluctuation, combinations of material particles? But if you believed that you were or you are an eternal soul, and then someone convinces you, no, you're just a computer program and you're an artificial, sport for some higher civilization, well, that might really cause you to panic and have a really bad day and the rest of your life. So however you answer these questions, Nietzsche would say, love fate, amor fati. He would say, from now on, this was on New Year's Day, he says, I want to beautify the world by seeing the necessary as the beautiful. So if something happens and it's necessary, it's inescapable, I want to see that as beautiful. That way I'll see the whole world as more beautiful. At the very worst, I'll just turn away. I won't say anything is bad. So it's similar to what Nietzsche's saying, what Nick Bostrom says. Nick Bostrom says, well, just get on with your life. Nietzsche goes one more than that. He'd say, oh, you live in a computer simulation? Well, either turn away from that, and since that would be impossible, since you are a simulation, then you should love it. Oh, this is beautiful. I live in a computer simulation. That's the most beautiful thing I could have heard. that gives order to the universe. I know that there's meaning in the universe because it was meaningfully programmed by some higher being. There's a bunch of different ways you could interpret it. The main point is that you know what Nietzsche said about amor fati, and you know what Nick Bostrom said about the third possibility, which is that you are almost certainly in a computer simulation. So discussion question 3 on page 223. He wonders if we could tell whether we were in a simulation or not. What are the implications of this? Explain. Well, he said that if the people who create these virtual realities had sophisticated enough technology, you might not ever be able to tell the difference. And what's the implication of that? Well, in his mind, the implication is it could be that you are almost certainly in a simulation. There'd be no way to tell you're not. I do want to point to one thing he says here on the second full paragraph on page 220. He says, given substrate independence, that means given the assumption that consciousness can be imprinted on any material substance, it is in principle possible to implement a human mind on a sufficiently fast computer. Doing so would require very powerful hardware that we do not yet have. It would also require advanced programming abilities or sophisticated ways of making a very detailed scan of the human brain that could then be uploaded to the computer. Although we will not be able to do this in the near future, the difficulty appears to be merely technical. There is no known physical law or material constraint that would prevent a sufficiently technologically advanced civilization from implementing human minds in computers. So that last sentence there, he says there is no known physical law or material constraint that could prevent a sufficiently technologically advanced civilization from implementing human minds in computers. Well, there's also no known physical law that can describe what a human mind is. So how do you know there's no known physical law that could prevent you from imprinting a mind on a material substance if you don't even know what a mind is? That's one of the major problems in the scientific world. There's no scientific description of what consciousness is. It's assumed by most in the field that consciousness is a byproduct of some computational architecture of some material underpinning, some computational substrate that he's taking. But as we've seen other philosophers like Leibniz and Plato, they say, and Descartes, they say consciousness cannot arise from a compound of material particles. They say consciousness is a simple substance with no extension in space. And I've drawn the parallels with the gravitational singularity, a mathematical point with infinite density. So the way Nick Bostrom is talking is if, and he says we'll take this for granted. It's not universally accepted that consciousness comes from matter, but we're going to take it for granted. So he's open about it. But that is a big leap of faith. Leibniz's argument was, well, imagine taking a brain and expanding it to the size of a mill, like a sawmill, and then walking around inside. All you'd see was the interconnection of parts, none of which, he says, could explain consciousness. So consciousness is not a byproduct of material compounds. It is its own simple substance. That's what Plato would say. So when you're comparing this view with Plato's cave allegory, that's the fundamental difference, despite the fact that they both say we probably live in a simulated reality. Okay, so the next reading is Latina Feminist Metaphysics and Genetically Engineered Foods by Lisa Bergen. And that'll be the last reading for part 2 of our book, which is the fundamental question, what is real?